Good morning. Thank you for coming. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the Yellow Ribbon Movement, the Pinoy Pinay, the People Power, the National Youth Council, the Pinoy SACDEM, the Inside Gov. It all comes from the basic conviction, as is said in the invitation, that an enlightened citizenry is the key to a functioning democracy. And in this whole issue on the DAP and the Supreme Court, I feel and I observe, and I'm sure many of you agree because of the various points of view that are going back and forth, the DAP and the Supreme Court issue hold many elements rich for discussion on where our country should go, on what we should do. And so the purpose of this convention, forum, is to bring together people who truly care for the country, and we're not going to mandate any stand or any point of view, because that's what a democracy is, different points of view. But I hope that in these different points of view, we are at least together in one stand, that we all love the country, we all care about our future, we love God, we love our people, and I feel that if everyone, different organizations and different institutions come together in one place with at least that one basic thing in mind and at heart, even if there are varying points of view, because we all love the country, I truly hope that the day will issue points of enlightenment, information, and maybe a basic, clear understanding of where our country should go. So I'm truly happy you're all here, and I would like to acknowledge the efforts of the co-conveners, Rocky and Grace Jonko. My goodness gracious, where's Grace? You know, she's amazing. No, she brought together the three business groups. We have Gio Tiongson, is he here? For the National Youth Congress, and then Karina David. Of course, you all know her. And I'd like to acknowledge Phoenix, MAP, PCCI, MBC, the media, and all of you for coming on a Wednesday morning because you care. And for me, that's the most important thing. I love you all, and may the morning bring on enlightenment information for us all. Thank you very much.
You know, when I accepted the president's offer to assume the position of budget secretary in 2010, which is, by the way, accidental. I'm not a public finance guy. I already knew that formidable challenge were in the offing. But I'm not talking about the difficulty of making people teary-eyed and emotional over the national budget. It's very difficult. I leave that to the president's speeches. Instead, I'm talking about the difficulties of ensuring effective and efficient public financial management in this country. It's no laughing matter, especially in a bureaucracy that has learned over time to approach public expenditure with the same seriousness as you would use for, in some instances, knock-knock jokes. But me and my colleagues in the Department of Budget and Management already had an idea that our efforts to reform the budget would meet much resistance and opposition, especially from parties that had once profited from the weaknesses of the public expenditure process. We were out to change the national budget and its attendant processes so that public spending could finally be transparent, accountable, and citizen empowering, so that the budget itself could, for the most part, serve the needs of every Filipino. What we had not figured, however, was that I and the agency would find ourselves in the center of a national controversy, one that would evoke passionate discourse and discussion from all reaches of society. You know, after I spoke in the Senate, my driver came up to me and said, "Sir, ganun pala yung DAP eh." Okay. And yet, this controversy has also yielded confusion, as dissonant voices and opinions continue to ring across popular and social media, through our television sets and over sensationalized headlines. These days, it's getting harder than even to distinguish fact from fiction. It's much easier now to confuse conjecture for truth when it's presented with apparent conviction. I'm here today to talk about the source of all of this controversy, the Disbursement Acceleration Program, or DAP. You may have already seen me discuss the same before the Senate last week. Some of you may even have labored through the transcript of my presentation in an effort to study the issue in greater depth. But for the benefit of those who missed my presentation, I'm going to talk about the DAP, about how the DAP has allowed the administration to use public funds, savings to be exact, in a focused and an efficient way so that every peso spent will create a positive impact on the lives of our people. I'm also going to talk about the consequences of the Supreme Court's decision on the constitutionality of some aspects of DAP, as well as the Aquino administration's next course of action in the wake of the High Court's ruling. I ask for everyone to keep an open mind, to be receptive to the ideas I will be presenting. More important, though, is that we all remain constructively critical and discerning. Such a position, I think, will make for a fruitful discussion, which I look forward to once I've done with this presentation. When President Aquino assumed his post in 2010, we in his cabinet were given immediate marching orders to mobilize reform in our respective departments. There was an obvious and urgent need to overhaul our public institutions. For too long, our agencies were crippled by corruption and operational inefficiencies, one begetting the other, and in a vicious, seemingly infinite cycle. The bureaucratic processes that preceded actual project implementation were often choked with bottlenecks and red tape, creating delays and generous legroom for fund misuse and other irregularities. This spread out further into actual project execution, which was so bogged down by the kind of inefficiency that allowed for operational bottlenecks, fund wastage, and leakages. At the same time, the corruption that had infested public transactions stalled project implementation and made it even more inefficient and unresponsive to the citizens' needs. Key goods and services were either delivered late or not at all, while the public waited and waited and waited for the government to act on its promises. Repairing such a damaged bureaucracy, however, could not be accomplished overnight. While we knew it would take a while, we realized along the way that cleansing our institutions of corruption also meant that we couldn't implement projects as quickly as we like. Sure, establishing due diligence meant that our work in the long term would be more efficient, transparent, and accountable. But we couldn't deny that the work of reform was, in the immediate term, slowing down public spending and consequently project implementation. The difficult work of reforming and performing at the same time. I have to note that before this, we had already established some key reforms to make spending more transparent, efficient, and participatory. One of these was zero-based budgeting, or ZBB. Through ZBB, we studied the effectiveness of various programs and projects and modified or removed budgetary support for these items as needed. We also began the meticulous work of disaggregating lump sum funds, and there were many in the budget before. A lump sum fund is an allocation that does not specify exactly where the money will go. So, for example, if the Department of Health has 10 billion in lump sum funds for its health facilities enhancement program, it was impossible almost to know where the funds would actually go during budget execution process. In many instances, lump sum funds create opportunities for anomalies and fund misuse. Despite these measures, and because of the house cleaning we were doing across all implementing agencies, government spending slipped by over 11% in the first 6 months of 2011. By the third quarter of that same year, the country's GDP level peaked only at 3.1%, down from 7.3% growth rate posted in the previous year. These were extraordinary problems. On the one hand, we were pushing our anti-corruption and good governance agenda across departments and agencies. On the other hand, however, public expenditures were lagging, and the country's economy was leaning towards a precarious position. A creative solution was therefore necessary. Thus, the DAP was conceived as designed and implemented. DAP was a spending reform measure that channeled savings towards swift-moving, high-impact projects with the specific objective of quickening disbursements and spurring economic growth. At this point, I'd like to clarify that the use of savings as a practice is neither scandalous nor unheard of. It has in fact been practiced as far back as the administration of the late President Cory Aquino, President Ramos, and President Estrada, under which the use of savings assumed the name of reserve control account. It was an impoundment tool to deal with problems of fiscal uncertainty. Under the Arroyo administration, the practice was simply called the use of overall savings. You might wonder why something as seemingly simple as the use of government savings would have very different names from one administration to the next. This is simply because the country's economic and political climate was never static. Each president confronted unique fiscal challenges, fiscal and economic challenges, and likewise political, that likewise demanded their own unique solutions. One of which was usually the management or utilization of the government's savings. So while DAP was the use of government savings for a specific reason, as was the case in previous administrations, it differed in the novelty of its focus. Through DAP, we wanted to use funds quickly and efficiently. We did not want to impound funds, and with greater transparency, accountability, and openness, so that key goods and services could be delivered to the public, so that the economy could expand to accommodate the country's growing needs. As many of you know, DAP was launched in 2011, about the third quarter of that year, during which it still attracted very little attention. The fact that it barely made to the front pages, however, didn't mean that nothing was being done. If anything, too much was happening. In the past, some regional and local government offices complained that there was nothing to do, that there was no budget for the implementation of projects. This time around, and thanks to the DAP, these same government sectors had to keep up with the sheer volume of work they had to finish for the communities they served. Kung dati nagrereklamo ang mga kawani ng pamahalaan na wala silang ginagawa, ngayon, nagrereklamo sila dahil sobra-sobra na raw ang trabaho nila. And that is true. You go to every district in this country and you see public works, paving and rehabilitating roads in just one department. Many of the projects that created a direct, immediate, and substantial impact on citizens over the last 3 years were actually funded through DAP. Of the 144.4 billion, by the way, just to put this in perspective, 144.4 is actually 2.67% of the budgets of the 3 years where DAP was implemented. And if you think about contingency money, 2.67% is not necessarily that large. Of the 144.4 billion released through DAP, a big percentage, 37%, was used to support economic services. Infrastructure projects also got 34%, while social services, for education and health principally, received 21% of total releases. Social services received a significant boost from DAP. For example, the Spending Acceleration Program allowed us to direct funds towards the Department of Education. We were able to advance the construction of about 15,000 classrooms, for example, in anticipation of the needs of the K-12 program. As well as for the implementation, for example, of innovative programs like alternative learning systems. Communities in ARM likewise received support through DAP, with the DSWD providing post-disaster assistance and protective services for families living in high-risk areas. DAP also funded the construction and provision of public health facilities all over the country, as well as the construction of irrigation systems and farm-to-market roads for our expanding agricultural sector. The program also enabled us to enhance or construct much-needed airports, as well as develop or improve the maintenance of historical sites, in line with the administration's goal of reinvigorating our tourism industry. So many other projects received support via DAP. If you watched the President's SONA yesterday, you would have heard, or the other day, the testimonials of 2 young Filipinos who received TESDA training for work scholarships, a program that the national budget supported through DAP. TESDA even partnered with BPAP, the Business Process Outsourcing Association of the Philippines, which actually I initiated, in implementing scholarship programs. Other DAP-funded initiatives include the payment of unremitted GSIS premiums for DepEd teachers. Karina should know this because it's been a problem that for some years was unattended. And of course, sitio electrification projects, as well as the construction of roads and bridges. The program has also as well supported various disaster risk management programs and requirements, including, of course, now the very useful dream project of the DOST under Project NOAA, and the acquisition of so many radars installed in our 18 river basins. Beyond meeting the needs of Filipinos on the local and community level, the DAP proved successful in in helping prop up the economy, exactly as it was meant to be. Before launching the program, our GDP grew by only 3.7% in 2011. After we launched DAP, and in conjunction with the Aquino administration's other governance and fiscal reform measure, we've seen a remarkable improvement in the country's GDP growth. The country's GDP rose by 6.8% in 2012, later soaring by 7.23% in 2013. DAP continued to fuel spending and implementation of key programs and projects well until December 2013, when we in the Department of Budget and Management, together with the Department of Finance and NEDA, recommended the termination of the program to the President. Between the program's official launch and its termination, however, we saw the economy expand in more ways than one. Not only did our GDP make unprecedented progress, we also saw a jump in our GDP per capita levels. In 2009, the country's GDP per capita sat at $1,832, later increasing to $2,136 in 2010. This year, our GDP per capita has reached $2,765, almost 30% increase over 2010. Essentially, this means that we're looking at a population with greater buying power, when a growing number of Filipinos now have more resources to spend on themselves and their families. Most encouraging is the fact that poverty incidence has actually decreased from 27.9% in the first 6 months of 2012 to 24.9% in the first semester of 2013, effectively bringing 2.5 million families, poor people, above the poverty line. The fact that we've managed to significantly cut down poverty rates in just 1 year is actually remarkable, given that poverty incidence in the country, over the course of 4 years, given that the poverty incidence in the country remained unchanged for years. If the trend continues, and we are confident that it will, given the massive investment we intend to keep pouring into poverty reduction programs for the coming 2 years, it is likely that the government will be able to achieve its Millennium Development Goals, specifically that of lowering poverty incidence to 16% by the end of the president's term. That DAP allowed us to achieve so much and to such an extent is remarkable, given the fact that we did all of this without raising taxes, except, of course, with the exception of the sin tax reform, and without sinking the country into further debt, if you look at the proportion of debt to the GDP. Effective tax management alone helped bring government tax revenues to 1.53 billion in 2013, around $500 million more than collections in 2010, where tax revenues hit just about 1.09 trillion pesos. Just as heartening is the level of our debt as a percentage of GDP, which has sloped off to 49.2% of the country's GDP as of 2013 versus 68.5% we were seeing in 2005. We're even looking at pulling that lower to 46.6% of GDP by next year. Meanwhile, interest payments comprise only 2.8% of the country's GDP last year, down from 5.3% in 2005. We plan to bring that down to 2.6% by 2015 so that more of the country's public resources can be directed to the administration's socioeconomic development programs. At this juncture, I would like to orient ourselves to the wider context that these accomplishments are founded on. Too often, critics pay excessive attention to the numbers we aren't yet reaching, to the targets that here and there we may have fallen short of. What the naysayers fail to appreciate, however, is exactly where we are coming from. Where was the Philippines in the world's economic and governance map before the Aquino administration took over? Have we, in fact, made any progress since? The answer is wonderfully plain and straightforward. At no other time and under no other precedent has the Philippines gained so much in just a matter of years. There is no question DAP's success, both at stimulating public spending and catalyzing economic growth. The World Bank has affirmed as much in its March 2012 Philippine Quarterly Update. Even the Supreme Court decision on DAP concedes the same. The Aquino administration's spending acceleration program did not just ramp up public spending, it also helped push the country's economic growth, besides benefiting the lives of Filipinos on the ground. Before I proceed, however, I must emphasize one thing. The Supreme Court did not declare DAP as unconstitutional. Only certain acts and practices observed under the program. Most notable of this is the cross-border transfer of funds. While the court did express its disapproval of the other components of DAP, like the definition of savings, the timing when declaration of savings may be made, the activation of the unprogrammed funds, and the timing when excess or new sources of revenues can be declared, the definition of item of appropriation as distinguished from allotment classes. What we find more peculiar is its ruling on cross-border transfers between the independent branches of government and certain constitutionally autonomous agencies. The rest of the High Court's objections to DAP, which I earlier ran down, are really, in my view and in the view of the administration, not constitutional issues really, but issues of statutory construction or how we interpret the law and the rules. These concerns are not for the judiciary to resolve. Instead, they are for the legislature and the executive to act on. In fact, we have already drafted a proposed bill to address these problems, which we hope we will submit later, as we are set to submit the proposed budget to the lower house this afternoon. But unlike the rest of the court's contentions on DAP, the issue on cross-border transfers is one that can legitimately have constitutional ramifications on the way that the bureaucracy is run, as well as on the interdependent relationship between the three separate branches of government: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's take a look first at why the Supreme Court's unfavorable decision on cross-border transfer is something that we may in fact need to revisit. If you recall, some DAP releases cross borders between branches of government. That we concede. Acts which the court struck down as unconstitutional. What is curious, however, is the fact that the Supreme Court itself has previously adopted resolutions in favor of cross-border fund transfers. I'll start with one particular unbanked resolution issued by the Supreme Court in 2012. If you read former Chief Justice Artemio Panganiban's column in the Inquirer last Sunday, you would be familiar with this by now. In July 17, 2012, the High Court unbanked, resolved to earmark nearly 1.7 billion from its savings for the construction of the Manila Hall of Justice. The interesting thing about this resolution is the fact that the High Court did not have a budget for the construction of the Manila Hall of Justice. Instead, the budget for that particular project was lodged under the Department of Justice, which is an agency of the executive. For the construction to even take place, actually there was a groundbreaking that was conducted in August of that year. The DOJ's item for the Manila Hall of Justice would need to be augmented by the High Court's savings, a clear crossing of borders between the judiciary and the executive. Here's a better example. Though in another unbanked resolution, the High Court requested the Department of Budget and Management to transfer 100 million from the DOJ's budget to the judiciary for the construction of the Malabon Hall of Justice. Yet another cross-border transfer of funds, this time from the executive to the judiciary. Note too that this unbanked resolution was issued March 5, 2013, just 7 months before the Supreme Court began its hearing on the constitutionality of DAP. What is even more significant about this is the fact that the court did not request us to move savings from the executive to the judiciary. No. What they asked for was the transfer of appropriations originally for the Department of Justice towards that hadn't even been declared, which had not been even declared as savings. That's an even more fundamental question, especially for the High Court to make. Let me make it clear. While the unbanked resolutions were passed, none was consummated. But I think that you will agree with me that the fact of the matter is those unbanked resolutions were adopted. I am bringing all this up because we need to understand why the court's ruling on cross-border transfers can be confusing. The decision seems inconsistent with the Supreme Court's own behavior in prior cases. I'm not pulling this argument so that we can point to the Supreme Court and have them share the guilt. There is no in pari delicto sense here. This is not about honor between two constitutional violators. You know. The point is, there is no guilt here, as far as our interpretation of the Constitution goes. It's not a matter of saying that if we're wrong, then the Supreme Court should also be blamed because it's wrong. Instead, what we're saying is that the practice of crossing funds through borders can be reconciled with the principle of separation of powers, exactly as the High Court has proven with its own acts. We assumed that the same position as the court did when we implemented DAP, that cross-border transfer can be necessary at times. The fact of the matter is that cross-border transfers in and of themselves are not objectionable. They have in fact figured regularly across administrations, which means the contemporary interpretation of these provisions are in fact shared by previous administrations. Under extraordinary circumstances, and at the behest of the requesting institution, the executive has lent budgetary support to other branches of government and other constitutionally autonomous bodies. Some of you may wonder, wouldn't this threaten the separation of powers among the three branches of government? Wouldn't this undermine the integrity and independence of each branch as they fulfill their duties, and then undermine, ultimately, the exercise of checks and balances between branches of government? To answer this with greater insight, we must recognize one thing before else. As separate as the three branches of government are, they are nonetheless all working under a single government. If one branch must aid the other, then so be it. A prime example for this is the assistance that the executive gave to the COMELEC, which is a constitutionally autonomous body that works independently necessarily of the three branches of government. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that that COMELEC must procure, not lease, the PCOS machines. At the time, the COMELEC had savings, but not enough to be able to make up for their 4.1 billion deficiency. So what did they do? Of course, they first thought about going to the legislature for a supplementary budget, but it was already October, and time was of the essence. The elections were in May. The COMELEC approached the executive through the DBM for help. They needed additional funding to purchase the PCOS machines for the 2013 election. And if you recall the shrill voice of Chairman Brillantes then, he was threatening, if you don't give us the money, we will go back to manual voting or have no elections at all. Of course, I got scared and gave him the money, 4.1 billion. Given a situation like that, what would you do? Say no to the COMELEC and risk a certain return to manual elections or have no elections at all? I mean, we had to come in and help. That's cross-border transfer. Is that necessary? So the need was clear and the circumstances were extraordinary, and so therefore, upon the request, we granted the request. Put simply, it's true that the executive, legislature, and judiciary function independently of each other. That's important. However, they share a naturally interdependent relationship where the success of one relies heavily on the support of the other two. It's an elementary principle, one that legal fundamentalists tend to overlook as they pound their fists on the Constitution. A rigid, absolutist approach to the law may overlook the important point that the success of one government actually hinges on the ability of the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary to work well with each other. Yet, most troubling in the Supreme Court's decision is what Chief Justice Art Panginiban says, two alien paragraphs entering into the ponentia of the decision. And this is really the presumption of bad faith on the part of authors, proponents, and implementers of DAP. After saying that the DAP did the country good, after saying that the doctrine of operative fact applies to this case, and now I've shown you that in some of their decisions, they passed resolutions that somehow jives with our interpretation. Then comes two paragraphs that says, we are presumed to be criminally, administratively, and civilly liable for all of that, unless we could prove otherwise. This was quite a shock for us. How can criminal, civil, and administrative liability be suggested in a case where the doctrine of operative fact had already been applied to the adoption and implementation of DAP? This is very clear in the decision of the Supreme Court. The presumption that we had acted in bad faith is a perilous one. First, it upends the principles that one must be presumed innocent before being proven otherwise, and that public servants must be presumed to have acted with regularity in fulfilling their duties and functions. There is no way that your government can work without that. And here I quote Associate Justice Marvick Leonen, who in his concurring opinion said that, and I quote, "The declaration of unconstitutionality per se is the basis for determining liability is a dangerous proposition. It is not proper that there are suggestions of administrative or criminal liability even before the proper charges are raised, investigated, and filed." He later adds that, and I quote again, "In the Supreme Court's jurisdiction, the presumption of good faith is a universal one. It assures the fundamental requisites of due process and fairness. It frames a judicial attitude that requires us to be impartial." Not only is the presumption of bad faith in complete disharmony with the doctrine of operative fact, it can actually send a chilling effect through the bureaucracy, and it already has, where fear of punitive action can hamper the Aquino administration's reform agenda and impede the progress that we in government have so far been making. As I mentioned earlier, DAP was a unique response to a unique and equally urgent fiscal problem. If we are to assume ill will of its authors, proponents, and implementers, what does this bode for the other reform-minded individuals who confront bureaucratic bottlenecks with progressive solutions? The Supreme Court themselves said it. DAP worked to the benefit of the people. If a reform measure has successfully proven its effectiveness, surely the law must encourage similar reforms to take root. Our legal system must match the inventiveness with which we are grappling with contemporary problems. Otherwise, it remains an inflexible, inhibiting force, one that can only stymie creativity and prevent necessary reforms from effecting change in the country. In other words, the potentially negative impact of the High Court's ruling will not only ripple through government operations. It will likewise slow down the reform momentum we have already set in motion, and consequently affect the pace and efficiency with which government can serve its people. If much needed reforms are frustrated before they can even take off, we cannot expect critical goods and services to be delivered to the public exactly when they're needed. Whether these services are for social protection, economic expansion, disaster preparedness, and climate change management, or national security and lasting peace. I said it in my Senate presentation, and I'll say it again. The Philippines did not become one of Asia's best performing economies by playing it safe. We did not become global pioneers in government transparency and openness by playing it safe. We did all this through the advancement of bold and innovative reforms, sometimes painful, under the President Aquino's leadership. It would be a terrible shame if landmark measures such as that on DAP, landmark jurisprudence such as that on DAP, can bring our reform progress to a grinding halt. And all after we have achieved so much. I'm here today to call upon you, the members of the private sector, civil society, business groups, the academe, and all of us here, to appeal to you who count ourselves ordinary Filipinos, to help in strengthening the Aquino administration's governance reform agenda. As many of you already know, the administration has filed a motion for reconsideration with the Supreme Court on its ruling on the constitutionality of DAP. Because while we respect the Supreme Court's decision, we do believe that our position has more than its fair share of merit. Given the undeniable success of DAP and the benefit it has wrought on our economy and the lives of our people, we believe that it behooves the court to revisit its own ruling, as well as consider the serious repercussions that its decision may have on the government's ability to serve our people's interests. We believe, too, that parts of the ruling, the presumption of bad faith in particular, must be stricken out if the administration is to surmount the country's development challenges in the fashion it always has, with the full fervor of reform and with the same brand of creativity that has allowed us to accomplish so much in just 4 years. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now in a rare and fortuitous position to ensure that the Philippines stays on the path towards rapid, inclusive, and sustainable growth. As we face the 2 remaining years in the President's term, we look forward to establishing broader and deeper governance reforms so that we can ensure the continuous advancement of our anti-poverty, anti-corruption, and economic reform initiatives. I know before this talk or during this talk, many of you may be thinking so much has already been said about DAP. In fact, I was told, why pursue the case in the Supreme Court? You just have to respect the High Court because they know what to do, Maybe not. And somehow many of you may have probably grown tired of the public din that has long surrounded the program. Knowing this, nonetheless, I'm grateful to all of you for giving me this opportunity to speak candidly about DAP and to spotlight the fundamental concepts that have since been eclipsed by conflicting or misleading commentary on the issue. Having said all of this, I nevertheless wish to assure you of one thing. Whichever way the High Court decides on DAP, we will forge on towards rebuilding our public institutions so that they can better serve the people. DAP was only one means for us to ensure that every peso spent by government will translate to real and immediate benefits for our people. And we will not be discouraged from working towards that ideal. The President himself showed this in keener detail in his SONA, our pursuit of governance reform and of greater transparency, accountability, and engagement with our citizenry in the budget have already done so much for the country's poorest and marginalized. With your help, we believe we can do much, much work.